I'm going to be talking mostly today about the environmental guidelines for surface waters. It's a document that was released in draft form back in the fall, and we're just putting the finishing touches on it. Mostly I want to talk about the implications of the surface water guidelines for the Tier 1 and 2 soil and groundwater guidelines, because we do refer to them for some of the pathways in the Tier 1 and 2 guidelines. I'm going to follow up with just a really quick update on some documents that are coming out or have come out related to the Contaminated Sites Management Framework. And then I was asked to give a little update from the ESRD view of things on how the transition of upstream oil and gas, coal and oil sands, the reclamation and remediation programs for those sectors, moving over to the Alberta Energy Regulator, kind of what's happening in our shop around that. So I'll start off with the environmental quality guidelines for surface waters, and just a little background on what these guidelines are about. In a lot of ways, they're very similar to the Tier 1 guidelines. They're generic values. Some cases they're narratives. Nutrients, for example, are handled by a narrative. And they're recommended to protect different types of water uses. And they're based on science. There's a lot of toxicology information that goes into them. They're the best estimates we can make of what no effect thresholds would be for surface water bodies or safe levels. They don't consider social, economic, technical factors. They're really based on science and the toxicology data that has been gathered for the various substances. They derive their legal authority when they're used in other regulatory instruments. So if they're used in, let's say, an environmental protection order, or if they're used in an approval for a facility, that's where they get their legal weight from. Outside of those instruments, they're really intended as guidelines to help people understand if they're looking at a surface water body, what that water quality is like. So very similar to the Tier 1 soil and groundwater guidelines in that sense. We use them and others use them for a wide variety of uses. They're used in our ambient monitoring programs. We do a lot of surface water quality monitoring, and these serve as some benchmarks that we can compare the results against. They're used to develop water quality objectives, and the objectives would be objectives for a particular water body. Sometimes if we're managing a particular water body, we need some endpoint for whatever the parameters of interest are. We'll draw those from the aquatic or from the surface water guidelines. They're used to develop effluent limits for approved releases. We use them water quality management frameworks, and of course they're used for assessment of spills that go directly into surface water bodies, which happens from time to time. The last time we released the surface water quality guidelines was back in 1999. So there's been a lot of work since that time on gathering toxicity data for substances, a lot of work on developing better protocols for actually developing the guidelines. One example, a CCME came out with a new guideline or protocol for developing their aquatic life guidelines, and we've been using numbers, or will be using numbers that are developed with that protocol. In order to develop and revise the guidelines, we set up a cross-ministry team. It had representatives from different parts of ESRD, and we also brought in Alberta Agriculture because some of the guidelines are directly related to agricultural water use. We brought in Alberta Health because there's some recreational guidelines that are more focused on health impacts to users of water around pathogen limits, blue-green algae, that kind of thing. So the group did a jurisdictional review of guidelines and approaches that are used across Canada and the US, and also took a look at European countries as well. We hired a consultant, a specialist, I think it was out of Great Britain, to actually review the different protocols that are being used in other jurisdictions as well as our own, and do a comparison and make some recommendations about which protocols he felt were the most robust. And then with that information, we actually went through all the guidelines that are out there for the different substances we were interested in, and our aquatic toxicology people picked one of the guidelines for each substance based on the protocol that was used, based on the strength of the toxicology that went into developing those guidelines. In most cases, we ended up with CCME guidelines, but in some cases, there was some newer, better information that other jurisdictions had used more recently, and we adopted those. But so what you'll see in the new guidelines, if you're familiar with the old ones, there was 3 different guidelines in there. There was Alberta sometimes for some substances. There were US EPA guidelines, there were CCME guidelines, and you had to pick the lowest of them. We've gotten rid of that approach, and we're just going to have one set of numbers for Alberta, so it'll be a lot simpler to work through. If you were sort of watching the guideline development process, you would have seen these come out in draft form back in the fall. We had a public comment period then. We've been working through the public comments and have pretty much finished the revisions and have developed what will be the final guidelines. They're just going through the approval to release publicly process, and we're targeting April 2014 for that. So what you're going to see in the new guideline document, we've expanded and updated the guidelines themselves. We've updated aquatic life, we've updated agricultural uses, so that's irrigation and livestock watering. We've updated the recreational use guidelines. We've also added in a couple of new things. One are sediment quality guidelines, and I think those are mostly from the CCME. And we've added in guidelines for tissue residue as well, and that's really focusing on ecological consumers, so the moving of contaminants up the food chain. The guidelines that were out of scope for this process were human health guidelines, so we have not addressed drinking water or fish consumption guidelines that Alberta Health has. So those reside with Alberta Health. We use those guidelines provincially, but they weren't actually part of this review process. So just to run quickly through what you're going to see changes, I'm going to focus on the agricultural land uses and aquatic life, because those are the pathways that we refer to in our Tier 1 guidelines. We don't actually use the recreational or the other guidance, sediment quality, and the other guidance. So I'm going to just look at aquatic life and then agricultural uses as well. So you're going to see some new metals: boron, cobalt, and uranium. Probably boron is the only one that we see frequently as a contaminant in this province. We've actually had already adopted the CCME boron number into Tier 1. But now it's also being adopted into the new surface water guidelines. CCME just released the new cadmium number, so that's going to appear. I think it's actually a calculation based on hardness, if I recall, but we're going to see that in the new guidelines. All the guidelines for inorganics are based on total concentrations if you're doing surface water evaluations, except for aluminum and iron. Those are both dissolved. So you're going to see a new guideline for dissolved aluminum. I'm not sure the iron one changed, but there's a clarification that guideline is actually meant to be applied to the dissolved fraction. You're going to see new pesticide guidelines. Most of those are probably not ones that we see commonly on contaminated sites. Usually we're dealing with the sterilants. That would be more common. They're probably guidelines that would be more frequently used in surface water bodies for things like spray drift and that sort of thing, if you're monitoring that. You're going to see a new chloride guideline. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. We were talking about that last year as well. CCME adopted a new chloride guideline of 120 milligrams per liter, so it's quite a bit more stringent than the old one, and we will be adopting that into Tier 1 as well. I'll talk about that in a minute. That's probably the biggest change that's going to affect the contaminated sites world, would be that chloride number. There's also a new sulfate guideline for aquatic life, and it's going to be a hardness-based set of numbers. The water quality folks have brought in some guidelines from our Tier 1 guidelines. When we develop Tier 1 guidelines, we've got those aquatic life pathways, and sometimes we're working on substances that didn't have an aquatic life number, so we went ahead and developed one ourselves. And so now those numbers have been reviewed by our aquatics folks, and they've decided that they will include petroleum hydrocarbons in the new guideline. And I'm going to have a couple of slides on that because it's a little bit more complicated, and there's actually been some significant changes since the draft went out. But there will be numbers for petroleum hydrocarbons. They've also brought in the glycol numbers, the amines, and methanol, all of which were developed actually through PTAC projects, the organization that Oli was talking about before lunch. we had some aquatic life numbers for some of the PAHs in Tier 1. We'd drawn those from a draft CCME document at the time. In the end, when CCME finalized their guidelines, they didn't adopt a lot of the aquatic life guidelines for PAHs. Our water quality people have taken the same approach. They have not adopted them. We're actually going to be pulling those out of Tier 1. So I'll mention that a little bit as we get into the Tier 1 changes. Updated guidelines for benzene, toluene, and xylene, so that's going to lead to a few changes for us. Benzene in particular is quite a bit more stringent than the old aquatic life guideline. So petroleum hydrocarbons, and if you were reviewing the draft that came out, you would have seen a table like this that it didn't have guidelines for F1 or F2. What it had were individual guidelines for each of the subfractions that make up F1 and F2. And they caused a fair bit of consternation out there. We got some pushback because some of them are really low numbers. I'm looking at that F2, the aliphatic C12 to C16, that's 0.074 micrograms per liter. That's an extremely low number. A lot of those numbers are below detection limits, and the labs also responded that it's really difficult to separate the aliphatic and the aromatic components. So it would have been a much more complex analysis, probably a lot more expensive, and detection limit problems. So we took a look at some of the other options we might have for developing petroleum hydrocarbon guidelines that would be equally protective. One thing to note here, it kind of factored into how we reviewed the guidelines, is that the more toxic components actually have much lower solubility. So that means if you've got a mix, which you always do, fraction 1 and fraction 2 are always mixtures of a lot of different compounds. Within that mixture, a very small proportion of that mixture is going to be the very toxic fraction. Most of the mixture is going to be the less toxic fraction because of the solubilities. Those more toxic fractions are much more constrained in terms of solubility. So they're going to be a much smaller proportion of that overall mixture. That's going to affect the toxicity of the mixture. So we looked at the options for developing aquatic life guidelines for hydrocarbons, and one option was just to use the subfractions. That was the original route we took, got the pushback. So we looked at how could we calculate F1 and F2 fractions, so not requiring analysis of the subfractions. Similar to the soil and groundwater guidelines, it would be actually measuring that entire F1 fraction and the entire F2 fraction. And there's about 3 ways we could go about that. One is to look at the solubilities of the subfractions, and you can do a calculation, kind of a weighted average based on solubility, and come up with an overall number for F1 and F2. So that we went through that exercise to see what that would give us. There's also a way of using surrogates. The CCME looked at this as part of the Canada-wide standard for petroleum hydrocarbons, and in that approach, you pick some compounds that you have a lot of toxicity data for that would occur within fraction 1 and fraction 2, and you use that surrogate toxicity and apply it to the entire fraction. So we looked at what the CCME did there, and that gave us another potential approach. And the final approach is to use a whole product toxicity, and this is a very simple approach. We've got lots of data for gasoline, and gasoline is fairly similar to fraction 1. We've got a lot of data for diesel, again, fairly similar to fraction 2, and you can use that approach to develop guidelines for F1 and F2. So our water quality toxicologist had a look at these various approaches. They decided to go with the latter one, the whole product toxicity, and what that gives us in the end are 2 guidelines, one for F1, which is 150 micrograms per liter, one for F2 that's 110. And that's what you're going to see in the final version. So analytically, it's a lot easier to deal with. Probably still challenging detection limits a little bit, but I think we're in the ballpark where hopefully the labs will be able to deliver on that. That's it for the aquatic life pathway. The agricultural guidelines, the changes are mostly, in fact, I think they're entirely to irrigation. And what our agriculture members of the committee did was they took a look at the CCME protocols, and there really weren't any new guidelines to speak of. That whole agricultural irrigation, livestock watering is not nearly as active an area of guideline development as some of the other, aquatic life, for example. But some of those guidelines were calculated using irrigation rates, and because they're drawn from the CCME, which is a Canada-wide kind of standard, and they use a fairly conservative irrigation rate that would probably be representative of quite a hot, dry area of Canada. So think kind of south central BC area. In Alberta, we're not that hot or dry. And Alberta Agriculture had some really up-to-date information about irrigation efficiencies and evapotranspiration rates. So they were able to give us a more reasonable estimate of irrigation rates in Alberta, which are 750 compared to the 1,200 that was used in CCME. So those guidelines which were calculated using irrigation rates have been recalculated for an Alberta irrigation rate. And that increases the values, the guideline values a little bit. It affects about 12 substances in that list. There's also some new irrigation guidelines. We are going to have an electrical conductivity guideline, a sodium absorption ratio guideline, and also brought in sulfolane and DIPA, and that was some work that was done in Alberta, probably about over 10, maybe 15 years ago, and has been adopted by the CCME, and now we're bringing it into our surface water guidelines. So that, in a nutshell, is the surface water aspect of the guideline development. The updated guidelines are going to expand and clarify the definitions, principles of using these guidelines. It's going to explain where the guidelines come from and the thought process in adopting them. And it's going to give some management guidance, so how to use and apply the guidelines. As I mentioned, we're planning to release them hopefully in April, so not very far away. They'll replace the 1999 version, and at the same time we're going to update Tier 1 and Tier 2 to make sure that we're consistent. So I'm going to run through some of the changes that you'll see in the Tier 1 guidelines. Tier 2 is a little more complicated because it starts to, it depends what pathways you're removing, and probably a bit too involved for the amount of time I have here, so I'm just going to focus on the Tier 1 changes. Groundwater guidelines are the ones that will see the most change. I'm going to start with what's not going to change. First of all, the petroleum hydrocarbons will not be changing, even though the surface water guidelines have taken a little different approach than what we used for soil and groundwater. Soil and groundwater, we used the subfractions. And we need to use those because we're actually modeling transport. And you can't really model the entire F1 fraction or the entire F2 fraction. There's too much difference between the different compounds within the mixture. So the reason we went to subfractions originally was to be able to better define the physical and chemical characteristics of that mixture and be able to model those subfractions separately, and then we combine them together when the transport has been modeled. So we're going to stick with that approach. There'll be no changes for petroleum hydrocarbon guidelines. You're going to see chromium is going to be split into trivalent and hexavalent. That's caused a bit of confusion with some consultants about how to deal with those two different types of chromium, because the guidelines are quite different for them. So I think this will clarify things quite a bit. I mentioned earlier that the aquatic life folks did not adopt some of the PAH aquatic life numbers. So for those ones, we're actually going to remove those out of Tier 1. And they also cause a bit of confusion from time to time. So that'll simplify the whole PAH application. There's still going to be 2 or 3 PAHs that have aquatic life guidelines because they are part of our aquatic life guidance. So those will stay, but the rest will be removed. We're also moving to express all the nitrogen species on an as nitrogen basis. So that's another place that was kind of confusing. We had, I think nitrate was expressed as nitrate, nitrite was expressed as nitrogen, and people got confused about what they were looking at. So both federally and provincially, we're moving towards a nitrogen basis for all those guidelines. In terms of revisions to actual numbers in the guidance, as I mentioned, chloride is going to be changing down to 120, except for agriculture. Agriculture has always been driven by the irrigation number, which is 100. But everything else will be driven by the 120 in aquatic life. You'll see the new sulfate guidance in there. Some of the trace metals are going to change, aluminum, chromium, uranium, for example. Some of the pesticides will change. Again, I think most of them are going to be ones that we don't frequently deal with at contaminated sites. Same with the other two, nonylphenol and ethoxylates will be changing. We don't run into that very often. Tetrachloromethane is actually, the change there is being driven by a change to Health Canada's drinking water guidelines, so we're adopting that as well. Those changes I just mentioned apply to all the land uses. There's a few that apply only to the agricultural pathway. One are the new limits for electrical conductivity, 1 decisiemens per meter at Tier 1, sodium absorption ratio of 5 at Tier 1, and you're going to see some of the pesticides are being revised largely because of the, some of them are actually being removed. Some of the old ones that have been banned for years we're removing, and some of them have been recalculated. In terms of soil guidelines, same thing, petroleum hydrocarbons, no change. We're just sticking with the subfractions. PAHs, again, we're removing those aquatic life guidelines. You're going to see a new soil direct contact guideline for tebuthyron. That's actually not related to the aquatic life guidelines or the surface water guidelines. That's some other work that was done, again, through PTAC. You're going to see revised guidelines for toluene that affects some of the textures and land uses, ethylbenzene for agricultural land use, some of the pesticides mostly driven by that change to the irrigation pathway, and then those latter two, the nonylphenol ethoxylates and tetrachloromethane will be changing as well. So our plan is to release Tier 1, Tier 2 as well. Tier 2 is going to be essentially just housekeeping, making sure all the tables agree with Tier 1. There's really no particular changes to the Tier 2 guidance. Tier 1 will be updated. SST will be updated, mostly for the chloride guideline. And there's going to be a minor change to the irrigation watering guideline too. It's not going to affect too much, I don't think, but you'll see a slight difference there. We're going to have a phase-in period, especially with the change to chloride. We want to make sure that sites that are close to being complete, or maybe they're already in the process of applying for a certificate, that they'll be able to work through the process under the old guidelines. And I'm not sure what the deadline will be. It kind of depends when we actually release the guidance, but there'll be a few months there to kind of clear up the old work that can come in. As long as the lab data is collected by the deadline, that data will be able to come in under the old guidelines, and then after the deadline, everything will have to be done in accordance with the new guidelines. So similar to what we've done with other guideline revisions. And the SST, I should mention, you're going to see some other revisions in the SST. Ones that we've talked about before. There's going to be the ability to adjust the impact area into smaller sub areas, so it's going to be a lot easier to kind of tailor your management and look at different management options within the SST. Also some ability to use actual measured distances to your receptors, so I think that will be useful. In terms of the contaminated sites policy framework, I've talked about this. I think I talked about it a little bit last year. You would have seen a few months back the contaminated sites policy framework document was out for review. That's been finalized and it should be released in the next maybe couple of weeks or so. I've talked about Tier 1 and Tier 2 guidelines here. Exposure control guidelines, if you're on our email notification list, you'd have seen an email a few days back that those are out for public review. So if you're somebody who works with risk management a lot, you want to have a look at those and get your comments into us. I think comments close towards the end of March sometime. The environmental site assessment standard was out for review back in the fall, late summer, early fall, and we were working through the comments on that now. I don't have really a timeline for when that's going to be finished. I'm guessing probably summertime, maybe somewhere early fall, something like that. And finally, CLRA asked if I would talk a little bit about what's happening at ESRD with the transition of oil and gas, coal, and oil sands over to the Alberta Energy Regulator. Policy remains with us, but all the operational side is going to the AER. Routine applications are continuing to be processed. Thankfully, when Lydia left, Jamie Legary volunteered to continue to process applications. Thankfully, otherwise I'm not sure they would have gotten processed. So she's been working really hard on that. She's, I think, pretty much caught up till about the end of December. We had a big flood of applications came in December, but she's been working away on those. Ones that don't get processed will, of course, just be transferred over to the AER and will be picked up by them. Non-routine applications have been, as always, going out to the regional staff. Some of the regions are pretty much caught up. Others are a fair bit behind. So those outstanding ones, again, will be going over to the AER for processing. I know a lot of you have been having trouble getting hold of reclamation inspectors, field staff, and we are down to a skeleton staff and getting fewer and fewer. So I think the reality is you're probably going to have trouble getting hold of them. The program is really winding down at Alberta at ESRD.